Hello everyone and welcome to Muscle Engineering Podcast. I am, as always, your host, Sotak Andrei, and you are listening to episode 42. But before we get into that, I want to wish you all a happy new year, and I hope that all of your wishes and more so the goals you set out for yourself will come true insofar as you're actually willing to put in the work to achieve them. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into what this week's episode will be about, which is a side interest of mine, namely mixed martial arts. I have become a bit of a MMA fan, so to speak. Unfortunately, just a viewer for now, but I definitely plan on also immersing myself practically into the various aspects of the sport. I have a bit of a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu experience, but not much. So in this episode, I have Lennon back on the podcast. Danny has been featured in episode 1, which if you haven't listened, I would recommend, where we discussed science communication and how to actually have a productive conversation with someone. In this one, I welcome him back to discuss one essential part of MMA, which I am not a huge fan of, and Danny isn't either, but it's just reality, and that is weight cutting. So aside from being the host of the fantastic Sigma Nutrition Radio podcast, Danny also works with elite combat sports athletes on the exact topic that we're discussing here, namely how to make weight in the most effective, efficient, and also the safest way possible. So in this episode, we got into everything you can imagine, like where should your scale weight be, how do you make the weight, what are the steps you can take, how can you rehydrate, refuel after the weighings, all that good stuff. We also touched on some other topics such as, how to deal with anxiety and bloating before or during a fight. And we also touched on the difference between MMA versus bodybuilding peak weeks, because it seems to me that many people are conflating the two. As you will hear, this episode has been recorded a while ago because we are referencing the December 14 card. I mentioned Alex Volkanovski, who is now the new featherweight champion. He has since fought and won the title from Max Holloway. Obviously, we recorded the episode before that, so just a heads up if you're wondering why the hell are we talking about that fight in the future tense. That's why. So I've rambled long enough. Let's get into episode 42 of the Muscle Engineer Podcast with Danny Lennon. There we go, Danny. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Yes, thanks for having me back on the podcast, my man.
You've been my first guest, so hopefully I made some improvements since then. We'll see.
I enjoyed our conversation, so I'm looking forward to another one now again.
We are going to talk about MMA and weight cutting, because that is one of your specialties. Where are your clients from, so to speak? Like, do you have UFC fighters as well, or do you work with fighters from other promotions?
Yeah, so right now on our current roster of clients, we'll have several that are fighting within Bellator. We've had some that have been within one fighting championship. We've had quite a lot that end up being on some of the promotions around Europe and on kind of more local cards as well. So it's a mix between those. And then we will also have some of our athletes who compete in jiu-jitsu. We have some judo athletes. We have some other combat sport athletes. But for the pro MMA guys, right now we don't have anyone contracted with the UFC, but we would have a few within Bellator that we've worked with, as well as some of the other shows around.
Got it. I wanted to start off with an interesting, or an observation that I made a while ago, and actually was hoping to do this with you, so I can ask your opinion, which is the difference in muscularity between people, because we obviously know that in bodybuilding there is a big difference between frame sizes and how much muscle someone can carry, but I think it's even more obvious in MMA. Like, if you watch, like, sometimes I watch these guys, and the difference in muscularity and build it's just insane. Like I looked up some stats in the featherweight division because I think that's a great weight class to illustrate my point. Because Zabit is 6'1" and he competes at 145. Now obviously he's a bit of an outlier, but still, like, to be 6'1" at 145 or make 145, that's insane to me. Because I know there are heavyweights who are 6'5" or even under, I think.
Right.
And meanwhile, like someone like Frankie Edgar is 5'6", Max Holloway is 5'11", but he's going to fight Volkanovski, and he's also 5'6". So I think this is a great example to illustrate this difference between people. And why do you think that is? Do you think that someone like Zabit, for example, intentionally doesn't put muscle on so he can make that weight class and simply have the advantage in reach and height?
So I do suspect that in a lot of cases, fighters will have gravitated to what they found early success in. And so those that are more naturally or genetically inclined to, say, have a frame like Zabit, where unless there was conscious effort put in to gain a lot of muscle, he would end up being someone that has the frame that he has, very tall, and can fit into these lighter weight classes and can make that weight relatively easy. And so coming up along probably would have seen some early success at that. I think that also you might have to factor in different styles that different fighters will use and what may benefit them from in terms of their frame size. And so it would make sense if you have some guys that have a background in, let's say, Taekwondo. They tend to be very tall for their weight class because that's a significant advantage in that sport. And so similarly, for guys that want to use long-range striking, it may be beneficial to try and be the taller guy in a weight class. And oftentimes that can be generally true anyway. But then you have certain frames where you have these stockier, more muscular guys who maybe have tended to come from a wrestling background where there's much more emphasis put on gaining muscle mass a lot of times. But I do think a lot of it is maybe not as planned as much as we'd hope. And a lot of it is guys have gravitated towards where they've naturally ended up. They've found some success, and then they just continue trying to go along with that strategy or within that same type of weight class. And as long as they're able to maintain some degree of performance, I think most of them stay doing that. And that's probably explains why later after many years of competing in a weight class, you see examples of some athletes changing weight class and then having almost immediate success. And so it might have shone some light on the reason they were in their old weight class was just for that's what they'd always done, rather than any real planned long-term view of, well, what body composition should I try and attain before thinking about weight classes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So where do you think if there is such a thing, which obviously probably isn't, but let's say hypothetically speaking, where do you think the ideal body composition would be? Because, there are some fighters who are like Zabit, very skinny. There are others who many people will look at them and be like, dude, you could probably, tighten up your diet a bit and make a lighter weight class. Because I know, for example, Gastelum moved up from 170 to 185, but if you look at him, he could probably make 170 if he wanted to, tighten up his diet a bit. Like Ben Askren was another example who kind of looked like that. He doesn't really look like the typical fighter image you have in your mind. And I know that in the MMA community, there is this big, or I think in general, like it's sort of accepted that the more muscle mass you have, the harder it is to keep your conditioning up. So where do you think the balance lies around muscle mass, leanness, and also having a good cardiovascular base or your ability to fuel that muscle mass?
Right. So when I've tried to think about what is an ideal body composition for an MMA athlete, there's probably 3 to 4 main factors that I think influence that. One is obviously things like genetics. The second would be their weight class. And I think you highlighted it, that at lower weight classes, I tend to see more homogeneity in the type of body composition you see. So like in the featherweights, you don't tend to see any with lots of body fat going around. As you go up to the higher weight classes, light heavyweight and heavyweight especially, you tend to see greater variance in the levels of leanness, and especially at a competitive level, it doesn't seem to matter as much, probably because you have a wider variation or a wider range in those weight classes, but also just because you have just generally bigger guys. So there does seem to be an influence of weight class. And then also the other one is individual performance. And this also ties in with weight cutting too, but also for levels of leanness, some guys can maintain a relatively lean body composition year round, and so they don't have any real dip in performance if they have to get really shredded, whereas some are a bit more sensitive to that in terms of their performance, and so they find that competing at a slightly higher body fat percentage, for example, leads to better performance, and maybe a bit more resiliency to injury or damage. So generally, if people were looking for arbitrary numbers, one way I've tried to categorize this is, let's say if we take for male athletes and we said a quote unquote ideal body fat range could be somewhere between 7 up to 12%, because I've definitely seen variation between any of that for athletes who are competing or close to competing, that they're sitting within that range. But as we've known, there are people that go above that as well and perform exceptionally well and are much better placed to compete at higher body fat percentages. Similarly, for female athletes, we might see something between, let's say, 16 and 22. And these are just arbitrary numbers I'm picking, but somewhere in that range for most of the athletes would probably be a range where you're lean enough, but maybe not so shredded that it's going to cause you problems with performance. But then there's also going to be exceptions where many perform at their best at higher body fat percentages. I think at a broad level, you could make a pretty strong case for being lean, and how we define what lean for an athlete should be is probably relative here as well. But just thinking of it logically, we know that muscle can produce force. So having more muscle gives the athlete more potential to use force. However, we're competing in a weight class, so you can't just gain as much muscle as possible without having to move up those weight classes. So the goal is, how much muscle can an athlete hold for a given weight class? And so the way you hold the most amount of muscle for a given weight class is to reduce the amount of body fat that athlete has so they can fit more muscle into that weight. So that would make the logical case for it. The leaner you get, then it allows you just to have more fat-free mass. So if we took two athletes of the exact same weight, let's say they compete at middleweight, which is 185 pounds or roughly 84 kilos, you have one who's 12% body fat and the other who's 20% body fat. That could mean you have a difference in both those athletes of maybe like 6 or 7 kilos of fat-free mass, even though they're going in the same body weight. So there's definitely a case to be made for leaner gives you that advantage of being able to have more muscle, and muscle allows you to produce more force. I also think it's there's obviously something to it, but I also think it's a bit of a lazy critique to just say if you have more muscle, that automatically means you're going to have terrible conditioning. I just think there's, with certain training modalities, there's ways to obviously prevent that, and it's not necessarily 100% true. So I think it's more about finding the point at which the athlete performs their best, because on one side I've just said that leanness is generally good, but we also know if we get them really, really lean, that can have impacts on both their recovery during camp, but also more importantly on their performance. So if you take the extremes of leanness, like a bodybuilder on stage, then their performance, if you try to put them through any rigorous activity like an MMA bout, is going to be pretty horrific at that specific time. So there is some threshold at which we could get an athlete too lean, and also then the side effect of having to diet them that hard to get down to that body weight is going to be negative. But there is a middle range of, I would say, relatively lean for most athletes is a good aim. And again, that may not be a precise answer, but that's probably the best we can do from a broad general perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a nice framework. Now, what I don't really understand, what I have questions about, is let's say someone does find out that they perform better at the higher body fat level, but how are they expected then, or how can they perform in the cage when they are very... So what I'm saying is, if for someone there's a huge difference between their off-season or whatever, off-camp weight and the weight they actually compete at, doesn't that hinder performance? Like, let's say someone competes at, 155, let's say, but then they are 190 plus, which is, from what I heard, not unreasonable. Like, wouldn't that hinder performance simply by having such a drastic shift in your day-to-day body weight, I guess?
Yeah, so of course there's going to be massive trade-offs to any of this, and the larger both the dieting phase and the weight cutting phase are going to present more significant risks, not just on the safety side, but for performance, if we just look at performance for the moment. So there's two components. If you are, let's say, when you don't have a bout coming up and an athlete is, like you said, 30, 40 pounds beyond their weight class, and they're going to have to diet down for several weeks during that training camp, which is quite common, that you diet over, let's say, a couple of months leading into the fight week. And the fact that you have to restrict calories in of itself is a downside for performance. So in an ideal world, if there was no having to make weight, the way you would structure your diet to make sure that you perform the best in the gym every day would be to have plenty of calories around. You wouldn't want to go through caloric restriction for long periods of time, but that's a necessity that we have to do in order to make a certain weight. So it comes down to a trade-off, and that's the balance, and that's the difficulty in athletes trying to pick the right weight class, because getting to the lowest one that you can isn't necessarily always the answer. There's this trade-off between what is the benefit I get from getting into a lower weight class and using these weight cutting strategies and going from something like 180 down to the 155 class, versus how does that negatively impact my performance, and then trying to make a judgment call of which class is worth going for and which maybe not. And I think many athletes actually still probably get this wrong or haven't tried alternatives, still with the presumption that the lowest class they can make is automatically going to be the one they're most competitive at. But in terms of how you would work that out ahead of time, it's extremely difficult, and a lot of time athletes only use it through trial and error. So you're right that if you have to, number one, diet aggressively for a significant period of time, and or you have to cut significant weight the week of a fight, they are both things that put your performance at risk. However, most are kind of hedging their bets on the fact that you can have a benefit of just being bigger at that lower weight class, or at least not at a massive size disadvantage to your opponent. So it's trying to tread that line between playing off that risk to performance and the performance advantage you get from being bigger.
Yeah, it's a very delicate subject and a very delicate issue to manage. I know I was listening to some episode from the Joe Rogan podcast, and I think he had a couple of guys from the UFC Performance Institute, and they were saying how, they run tests and stuff, so they try to figure out where their VO2 max and that sort of stuff are, and they try to make decision based off of that. So, but obviously we're talking at a very high level there, which most people probably don't have access to.
Yeah, I think even beyond that, a lot of the time you probably are going to see things that you would expect to see anyway. So most of the fight camps that athletes go through, and they're going to be under eating and dieting whilst doing a high workload of training. Over the course of that, you're going to probably see some decline in things like metabolic rate, in total energy expenditure, and so on, that we can probably predict is going to happen. Now, the interesting stuff, if you do have that data, is seeing the sensitivity of different athletes to that, say, caloric restriction and that low energy availability, and which ones have symptoms earlier than other people. And maybe that might give you an indication of who might get away with cutting more weight than others. But I think still a lot of it is trying to balance on an individual level between those two sides. So on one side, if you don't cut any weight, you have zero performance impairment, but you also have a size disadvantage. And then if you cut lots of weight, you have a size advantage potentially over your opponent, but you also have the highest risk for performance impairment. So if that's a sliding scale that we're thinking about, it's how long along that continuum do we put this particular athlete where they're going to get the essentially the best benefit from both worlds, or at least the maximal performance that they can, given the tough situation of that you probably need to cut weight if you're going to be competitive.
Do you work with these athletes in outside the camp as well, or are you just contracted for the last week of the fight camp?
So that is usually down to the athlete. So all of them are free to make their own decisions around this. So and that's probably one of the issues within combat sports. So a lot of the time it's left up to individual athletes to find a nutritionist to work with. And so in a lot of cases, it does tend up being that fight camp period leading into making weight and competition, especially because for nearly most athletes that are fighting professionally, until they get to some of the higher end of some of the big cards and the bigger organizations, financially it doesn't pay to be able to pay year round for services of what we do. But we do have some athletes that do work with us continuously, and as you would expect, that tends to be where we see the best results, because we can then manage body composition year round. We can have them in a place that before they start, let's say the 8 or so weeks leading up to a fight, that they're already starting that fight camp phase in good condition and in a position that we know that we're going to make weight in the most effective way possible, that it's not going to be too drastic, that their weight isn't yo-yoing throughout the year too drastically. And we can also build good quality nutrition habits, that so when the fight camp comes around, it's just a continuation of that, but with a few tweaks. Now, obviously that's not feasible for a lot of athletes to do, and I totally realize that. So we do still work with a number of athletes that we might not hear for a while, and then they get a fight booked, and then we'll work with them for 8 to 10 weeks, and then they might be gone again doing their own thing. And so it tends to be down to the athlete, but it's a mix of both.
Got it. So in an ideal world, where do you think someone should be, let's say, at the end of the final week? So let's say they have a weigh-in, usually that's on Friday, I think. And where should they be on Monday, let's say?
So again, this depends on a number of factors that relate to the athlete's experience with weight cutting, the level that they're fighting at, the response that they've had to previous weight cuts, the risk, the reward benefit of, is this a title fight, for example, and this is an opportunity you have to take. Also, other intangible things like their fighting style can play a role here. And again, this is not something we have any research behind, but anecdotally it seems to play out, and at least logically it makes some sense. For example, if you have someone with a very grappling heavy game, they may experience a greater benefit to cutting significant weight if they have a grappling heavy game where they have a strong top game, that they're going to be on top of someone for a large portion of that fight. For example, Khabib, right? If you're almost guaranteed that he's going to be on top of someone for a significant portion of that fight. So for him, carrying a large size advantage has a direct impact on his performance and the likelihood outcome of that fight. Whereas someone else we mentioned earlier, Frankie Edgar, is a example I give of when he was lightweight champion, he cut almost no weight. I think he would walk around at like 157 and then compete at 155. And if you look at his strategy when he was fighting at lightweight, it was constant movement. It was one of these people that never stopped moving, a kind of similar style to a Dominic Cruz. So maybe for that person, you'd say, well, yeah, if we cut less weight, he'll have much more energy than if he was cutting a lot of weight. So he can maybe use this type of strategy even though he's in a higher weight class. So that ties into it, and all those other factors. However, if we're trying to go with general recommendations at a large scale, where I've typically tended to recommend athletes be is a week out for that weigh-in. And this is, again, all on the presumption that it's a day before competition weigh-in. So they have typically most of these athletes have about 30 to maybe 36 hours between their weigh-in and competition. So a lot of our guys will, let's say, weigh in on a Friday morning and then compete Saturday night, something like that. So with that sort of lag time, a week out from the weigh-in, we said if we can get their body weight to about within 8% of their weight class, then that should be a relatively straightforward weight cut that still gives some of those advantages, but shouldn't really be any danger per se, or is mitigated as much as possible, and shouldn't pose really any performance detriments, or at least that we found. For some athletes, that can extend up as far as like 10% that we can do, and we know they do it quite reliably, but not for everyone. Once it's beyond that sort of level, then it starts to becoming quite a risk, and that I'm not so willing to, certainly not to recommend, but also that I think might be even counterproductive to a lot of people. So we'd say like 8% is kind of an ideal. And of course, some of them go less than that. We have athletes that only cut like 5% and feel great doing that. But like an upper level, about 8%, with maybe some people in certain circumstances, maybe 10% above their weight class a week out. And then anything beyond that just gets a bit too dicey for me to recommend.
I'm curious, like I didn't really look much into this topic, and I'm sure that my audience, who are probably more sort of physique or bodybuilding oriented, will be, left wondering like, oh my goodness, 8 to 10%. I mean, that's what I plan to lose in 3 months of cutting phase. So what are we talking about? Like, where are those kilos are coming from? Like, how much difference can you make simply by shifting your food habits and perhaps switching to what's called the lower residue diet, or perhaps I've heard that only switching to liquids, that sort of stuff. Like, how much difference can you make just from those nutritional interventions?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I should make this clear that really in that final week, when we're talking about all this weight loss, it's kind of clear that not really any of that is contributed by fat loss per se. The athlete is already lean at that stage. They may lose a few grams of adipose tissue, but that's not really anything that's contributing to that massive weight loss of that 10% drop in that final week. So it's an acute loss of their body mass, but not really changes in their body tissue. So what we are changing is, number one, their body water, 2, their glycogen stores or their carbohydrate stores, and then 3, gut residue. So with body water, there's a few components that we would do to change in essentially to dehydrate the athlete. If you lose water, you lose the weight of that water. So one is a water restriction, and often this is preceded by a water loading phase. So we have them on a very high water intake for several days. Then they have either 1 to 2 days of very low water intake and restriction to lose water and to dehydrate. Then we can manipulate sodium intake here as well. So again, maybe 2 days before weigh-in of going on a low sodium intake will allow for more water loss. We'll have the ability to use some induced sweating methods if they need to. So ideally, this is the last strategy that we'd use. Once we've done everything else, then those final couple of hours before weigh-in, we might have to get them to, say, go into a sauna or use a hot bath or do some light exercise. There's different ways that we can do that, and we can talk about that later on. But for a small amount of the weight, we can induce some sweating. So all of those are strategies to lose water from the body. Second, then we can deplete them of glycogen. So there's carbohydrate stores. So that's losing glycogen and also the associated water from their muscle and liver stores of glycogen. So this would just be a very low carbohydrate intake for that kind of week leading into the weigh-in. They start to lose glycogen. And of course, as most people who have gone on a glycogen depletion protocol know, your body mass changes quite acutely. And then the final kind of component would be a change in gut residue, which is simply the undigested food residue that's still in your intestinal tract. And one of the methods that we know that's actually been used as an intervention in a lot of IBS research, for example, is using a low residue or a low fiber diet. So when you strip those fibrous foods out of the diet and go on a low fiber intake for, we typically do about 3 days, you can see a drop of your body weight of about 1% on average, and that can be higher and lower than that depending on your habitual fiber intake. But the combination of all those things together makes it possible for us to be able to lose like that 8-ish% of your body weight in the matter of that week. And each of them contribute slightly differently, but it's the combination of them that is useful, because I think one of the mistakes that athletes will make is they hear about someone dropping like that 8%. They only think about the methods that relate to, say, particularly induced sweating, like getting in a sauna and maybe restricting the water intake. And an 8% dehydration is not the same as an 8% loss of body weight from a mixture of the dehydration, the glycogen depletion, the low residue diet, the low sodium intake, the low food weight in the few hours before weigh-in, having an earlier cutoff time the day before your weigh-in in terms of the time of your last meal, and so on. And so it's a combination of all of those. And then for each of those strategies I've mentioned, there's a different risk profile for each. So for example, the things like a low residue diet has almost zero risk for your performance. So you go in a low fiber diet for 2 or 3 days, that has no detrimental impact on your performance, but yet you can lose some of that weight. Whereas things like sitting in a sauna and losing half a kilo or a kilo of weight after you're already dehydrated has a very high risk of performance unless your rehydration protocol is spot on. And even at that, there may be some other downsides. So there's a different risk profile to each, but using them in a combination, we can lose the type of weight in those numbers I mentioned.
Hey guys, I interrupt the episode to remind you that as much as I love making these episodes, they do not pay the bills. Coaching does for me. So if you'd be interested in working with me in a one-to-one fashion, I also offer online coaching for a limited number of clients interested in body composition optimization. So if you'd like to lose fat, build muscle, or any combination of the two, then don't hesitate to reach out to me via an email. My email address is always in the description of these episodes, and we can chat further from there. I am also available for 30 or 60-minute consultations for people who are not quite ready to invest into a full-on coach just yet. Thank you, and let's continue the episode. Very, very interesting. And since you brought up, water intake and restriction and all that sort of stuff, I have to ask, because there is this old bodybuilding practice where they will restrict water in the I've heard as far as 2 days out, but certainly less 24 hours, and perhaps even in the day of the show. I know this is common practice still, especially here in Romania, even though most natural bodybuilder coaches I know don't do this. So where do you think, or what's the difference between MMA versus bodybuilding? Because obviously they are judged on different criteria. In MMA, they don't care about how you look, and in bodybuilding, they don't care how much you weigh. So what is the water intake procedure, and because you mentioned something about, I think you had a podcast with Reed Real, if my memory serves, about this, that you can sort of front load water and then shut it off, I think completely or at least significantly, and that will result in a water weight drop.
Correct. Yeah. So on the water loading, as the phrase that's most commonly used, is something that's been around in practice for a long period of time across several different sports. The idea of before you go through water restriction, so a few days of very low water intake, you precede that by having several days of very high water intakes. So for, let's say, the average person, this could be like 7, 8, maybe 9 liters of fluid a day. So very high intakes. And then that's dramatically dropped on either 1 or 2 days preceding your weigh-in. And this has been a strategy that's been around for a while, and based on different mechanisms, and people said, well, maybe it impacts certain hormones like aldosterone, which is kind of related to water retention. It allows us to essentially, the thinking was, it's getting your body to upregulate how much you're going to lose water through urination. And then when you restrict the water, there's a lag time before your body essentially notices or catches up. So you can continue to lose more water even though you've stopped taking it in. And that was the kind of idea. But really there was no research on this, at least in the types of strategies that had been used in combat sports until only recently. Like you said, Reed Reel did his study that was published, I think, in 2018. His was looking at the impact of water loading and restriction in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes. I think also some other grapplers maybe have been in that study, some judo and wrestling guys, but mainly Jiu-Jitsu competitors. And they had 3 days of the water loading phase, which was 100 milliliters per kilogram. So for an 80 kilo guy, that would be about 8 liters of fluid. Did that for 3 days. And then 1 day of restriction, which was 15 milliliters per kilogram of your body weight. And then the following day was a simulated weigh-in, or an actual weigh-in, but just not for a competition. And they would see how much water they had lost. And they compared that to a control condition where the first 3 days of the studies were just a normal fluid intake and then the restriction day. And that study was able to show that there was more body mass lost when the water restriction was preceded by a water loading phase for those few days, showing that when they went through the water restriction, they lost more fluid on that water restriction day if they'd done some water loading. So that was the kind of first thing that says, well, there's actually something to this. Actually, we still need more research to work out exact mechanisms of explaining what's going on. I think in that study, they had hypothesized that it's maybe likely down to changes in vasopressin. It's a certain hormone that can be related to our water retention. But there's still more ongoing work to look at that. But so we see that there's a difference here with water loading. So that's one particular method that we know can be quite useful. Now, to come back to your original question of how does this relate to a water loading and water restriction protocol that is typically seen in bodybuilding, for one, I should probably state that there are still many successful bodybuilding coaches, I would say, that know far more about specific peak week strategies that they want to use and that they have anecdotal experiences with their athletes that I'm not going to try and argue with because it's not something I do. And so people have to take that into account and maybe talk to some of those. From my perspective, the way I've always seen it is obviously with combat sport athletes, the reason why we do a water loading phase and a water restriction phase and try and dehydrate the athlete is to lose mass and to lose weight on the scale so they can make weight. And as you said, it doesn't matter what they look like as they step on the scale. And oftentimes it's not particularly good. The goal is to make weight. With bodybuilding, the idea behind it, at least from my understanding of what people have talked about, is this idea of if we do some water restriction and slightly dehydrate someone, we can lose some of the water from that subcutaneous layer just under the skin, and it can make someone look a bit tighter so we get a better appearance. Now, the issue to me on hearing that is I'm unaware of how we selectively can pick where we lose water from when we do a water restriction. So we lose body water for sure, but when you are losing some from under the skin, how can you stop yourself from losing water from your muscle, for example? And so if you're going to dehydrate yourself, does that not mean that you get a flatter appearance in the muscle? And certainly that would be my understanding. And I think there's probably several natural bodybuilding coaches who I know who don't use any water restriction. And I think for those same reasons, one, that they don't really see the inherent benefit, but also I think it takes out a variable that can cause a lot of chaos. So if you're going to use something like that, it throws in another unknown variable that you have to finally balance over the course of going into that show, instead of just being able to present your physique that you've worked to put out. So that would be my understanding as of now. So they're doing it for very, very different reasons. And I just think it doesn't make as much sense to me to try and do it purely for appearance reasons.
Yeah, so the way I see it is, I think it's two reasons. One is simply drug-fueled culture. And from what I heard, and obviously I know zero about this, but when you mix drugs into the equation, that changes things significantly, and there are certain compounds that retain more water than others, and they also use diuretics and that sort of stuff. So obviously there is this side which is not really mentioned, and natural bodybuilders just copy mindlessly. And the second part, I think, is just dogma and tradition, and basically, monkey see, monkey do. And like you said yourself, there is this, and I had this debate with a colleague of mine who is, I think since then I managed to convince him to stop doing this, but I know he did this as well. Like he would just stop water, and there is this romantic idea in most people's head, like the way they explain it is that you are depleted, but then you start carb loading, and he also, or from what I heard, he did like the water loading stuff. So the theory would be that you start water loading, and then you are full with water, but then you start introducing carbs, and you stop drinking water, and then those carbs are going to suck the water out of your skin and go straight into your muscles alongside the carbohydrates, and then you'll not only be full and carb loaded, but also you will look dry because obviously you have no water underneath your skin. And obviously that's a very naive and very romantic idea, but again, if you don't know or know very little physiology, then you can simply make up those gaps in physiology with your fantasy and your romantic ideas of how physiology is supposed to work. And there was a very good Peak Week episode with Eric Helms, and I think it was on Jeff Nipper's channel. It was a roundtable with Cliff and Helms and Peter Fitchen, I think. And Eric was mentioning that, you can't really, like, there is water in your muscles, there is water in your blood supply. Like, you can't really select, you can't just push a button to select where the water is going to come from. And Cliff was mentioning that actually what he's found that water restriction usually results in a softer look, not a harder look, or the way most people would want it to be.
Right, yeah. And I think that the challenge is that there's so much that is going to be based on anecdote, and it has to be because of the stuff that's being done within competitive bodybuilding, that we can't always look directly for a study to show us something, but we have to base it on physiology, which is the start point, which is what you mentioned, that there are things that we know from physiology that just will happen and other things that we know that can't happen. So once we have a basis of that, then I think there is still flexibility to understand what people are anecdotally reporting. The problem is we don't really know why we're observing some of these things and why it's working for some people and not for others, and what contributed to a certain look. And there's so many variables that kind of change over those few days that it gets really difficult to know what is actually going on at the level of those cells until we look at some physiology work and try and clobber together an explanation for what we're seeing.
So going back to MMA, how much, let's say you have made it to 24 hours before the weigh-in, and you are still you have still ways to go, like how much weight can you, or how much weight should you try to cut in the last 24 hours? Because I heard some very, very high numbers, like I heard even something like 15% or something ridiculous like that, and that's just crazy to me. Like how much weight, or what's, like, I'm curious, like what's the most extreme case you've heard perhaps from others, and what would be a safe amount you would actually recommend for most people?
So there's been a few that I've heard recently. One of the athletes that we've actually worked with at Sigma, he was telling about a weight cut that he did but previous to working with us, where the most he'd seen in the final 12 hours before a weigh-in, he'd lost 9 kilos in 12 hours. So that was pretty tough going, he was saying. So there's things like that. There's another guy I know here in Dublin, actually, who has worked with several professional boxers on their weight cuts. And they had one who's actually quite a well-known guy. I probably shouldn't mention him, but he's that he was competing for like world title fights in pro boxing, and he liked the strategy of making weight all in the shortest period of time he could. So he didn't do any other strategy apart from when it got to 12 hours before his weigh-in, he would basically have his hotel room turned into essentially a sauna through the use of these big industrial heaters he would bring in, and would start exercising, doing shadow boxing rounds of 3 minutes on, 1 minute off, sweat out a ton of weight, go to sleep, get up the next morning, do the exact same, and within that 12-hour period would cut all the weight he had to cut purely through dehydration and sweating. And he would only start trying to make weight 12 hours before his weigh-in. So that was how you see that all these different athletes have just different approaches that they have based on psychology and preference and just things that they've habitually done. So some of the cuts can be quite large. So like I said, that when we see something like 9 kilos in 12 hours, we would tend to try and stay away from that. And ideally, we'd want to, in the final day is still going to be where most of that weight across that week is lost. So if we go back to some of those strategies I mentioned earlier, the low residue diet will be working over the previous few days. But during the water loading phase, we're not really going to see any drop in body weight, or at least not that much. Some athletes have actually seen they start to see their body weight come down, and there's a few reasons maybe why. They're also probably still in a slight deficit. They're obviously started the low carbohydrate intake, so you're going to see their body weight gradually go down over the early part of the week. But most of the water loss still is going to happen in that day before the weigh-in. So I would say a sizable percentage of that cut is still going to come in that final day. So if they're losing 8% of their body weight, then we may see that 5% or 6% of that is going to come in those kind of that final day. But again, it just comes down to how much total cut the athlete has left themselves. Obviously, with the size of the athlete will relate to the absolute amount of weight they're going to lose, and then the individual suitability for large weight cuts, because some athletes can tolerate pretty well with seemingly not many downsides, at least to performance, and they can tolerate more. So there's some of the stuff that I was observed.
And let's say you managed to weigh in and you're good to go. Like how much can you actually regain, and what would be the most effective strategy to go with? Because I heard like Costa, for example, for the fight with Romero, I've seen that he was almost 15% heavier in the cage, and actually he is prohibited from competing in, I think it was in Nevada, at 85. Because they had a 15% rule, and he was like 14.90 something percent above the scale weight, and that's just crazy. I mean, I actually did the math. I think he was 27 pounds heavier.
Yeah, it's wild, and it kind of makes it funny to think about weight classes that we have in our head for certain athletes, when every time we've seen them compete, they've never actually been that weight. So it's just a funny thing to think about. But yet with the weight regain, we've had a few papers actually come out over the last couple of years that have looked at trying to predict the success of combat athletes based on the amount of weight that they can regain before competition. And there certainly does seem to be a strong predictive capacity of the more weight you can regain between weigh-in and competition, it kind of correlates at least with performance for a lot of athletes. And this probably just makes sense on one side. If you cut a lot of weight and don't put most of that back on, then maybe you haven't really restored your glycogen. Maybe you're still slightly dehydrated. Maybe you haven't been able to take on board enough fluids, electrolytes, and overall total calories, and so that is going to have some knock-on effect. Whereas if we plan out that rehydration and refueling stage appropriately, in an ideal situation would be to try and get the athlete back to 100% rehydrated, and to be able to get the carbohydrate intake most that we can within that time frame. That's not going to cause, of course, any gastrointestinal distress, but try and get enough carbohydrates back in so that they can enter competition with full glycogen stores. And so if we're doing those things, and obviously the fact that they can take in a large amount of calories if need be, and if they can tolerate that compared to being restricted on calories for quite a period of time, yeah, we should be able to see quite a large uptick in body weight. Most often we're trying to aim to see, can we get their weight to roughly around what it was at the start of fight week, and that seems to be pretty doable in a lot of cases, and that's just because you're restoring fluid and carbohydrate primarily back into their system, and obviously just because they're eating a bit more, there's more food in their system too, but that should happen relatively quickly. It becomes a matter of just having an effective timeline for doing so. So obviously when you have someone that dehydrated and with no carbohydrates, you can't just say, okay, just drink what you want and get as much fluid in right now and take this 10 liters of water and just drink it off, or have lots of food that you're just going to keep eating. We have to manage it in a way that look at what is the rate of rehydration we can achieve. And so we tend to say, okay, we're going to try and rehydrate at roughly a rate of maybe a liter per hour on average, and we'll go faster initially, but then on average it's about a liter per hour, because there is a limit to how much fluid you can take in and not just urinate it all back out. We'll look at from a carbohydrate perspective, have a set rate of carbohydrate ingestion that we can have, again, like a per hour rate we work out, but really that translates into consuming that every 2 hours or grazing on food throughout that period of time. So for example, we know if you give an athlete 100 grams of dextrose in a shake, then that's probably going to give them some gastrointestinal distress. And so we need to manage how we distribute that carbohydrate re-ingestion after weigh-in. And so we'll plan that out based on how many hours they have until their competition, and a host of other factors like when they're going to go to bed, trying to not have fluid intake too close to sleep that disrupts it, trying to cut off fluid intake early enough before they start warming up so that's not going to disrupt their warm-up before they go out, and things like that. But making sure that the total amount of fluid, the total amount of carbohydrate is taken care of, but it's also split up into doses that's going to be most useful over the course of that time. And then obviously just trying to pick foods that they're used to consuming instead of trying anything crazy just because they've made weight.
I actually wanted to ask about food sources, because I would imagine that when you're so depleted, certain foods might be an issue. And so do you mainly go for liquids, or do you also, because I heard, fighters say that they went out for burgers and fries, and I wouldn't imagine that would be the most effective strategy for refueling.
Yeah, so usually the first meal after they've stepped off the scale is always a liquid meal, and just for, obviously we want to get fluid back in as quick as possible, and it's convenient that we know exactly what they're going to consume. We can put the adequate amount of fluid, we can put electrolytes, and we'll typically put a carbohydrate powder in that shake, and they're going to be able to drink that as the first thing they have in terms of nutrient ingestion after making weight. They may have another one of those as their next meal, depending on how they feel. And we just know from experience that they often report that it probably takes a few hours before they actually feel good eating those solid meals. If they eat solid food immediately after stepping off the scale and it's a big meal, it just doesn't seem to digest pretty well. So we try and go first 1 to 2 meals are those liquid shakes that we have that can vary in components, but the most important ones is the fluid, electrolytes, and carbohydrate. We may include some other stuff as well. And then we will split up based on what types of meals that we know they digest quite well, that they're used to having throughout their fight camp. Again, we'll try and have it that they're not too quote unquote heavy, for lack of a technical term, in terms of meals that are very high in fat. For example, some guys just don't feel so good on it. And we are going to try and stick to higher carbohydrate feedings for all our meals over the course of the rest of the day. Depending on the athlete's preference and what they tend to tolerate, that could be some relatively standard large meals like a dinner with plenty of carbohydrate. For others, they prefer not to, and they prefer to graze more frequently. So for that, we're just looking at high carbohydrate based snacks on stuff that they're used to consuming, keeping in line then with our fluid intake of having a set amount of fluid per hour that we're aiming them to consume. And they're the main food considerations, really. And once we know that we can hit our target carbohydrate amount, then that's the main thing from a fueling perspective, and not having foods that are going to cause any gastrointestinal distress, or that the athlete hasn't tried before, or that we're worried might cause any issues. So that's the primary things, and within that gives actually quite a lot of flexibility in terms of specific food choices, which tend to get impacted by where the athlete's competing, what is available in the hotel or nearby shops of where they're actually staying, and that obviously depends on where in the world they are and what they have around them in terms of resources. Some may be sponsored by food prep companies, for example, which makes it quite easy. Others may have to try and find food locally. Others can find it quite challenging to get the type of food that we want. So all those things tie into what specific foods are consumed. But really, once we have those main principles taken care of, there's lots of flexibility with specific food choice.
This is something that I'm always wondering, like whenever I see these fighters, like I know for myself, like stress just fucks up my digestion like royally. Like if I get, even for any event that I might be, anxious or excited, my digestion just goes off the window. And I would imagine that for someone who has perhaps, let's say, a title fight, like I wouldn't imagine that they get to sleep very much the day before, and then also having this challenge of trying to refuel, rehydrate, that sort of stuff, and then the stress or anxiety of going into unarmed combat with another guy who's trying to take your head off. I would imagine that wouldn't be very chilling. So have you heard stories of fighters being bloated? Have you found ways to manage this, or ways to work around this? Because I heard the story, I don't know who it was, but Chael Sonnen was talking that the guy was about to walk out and he was like, I gotta take a dump. It was like, what do you mean? Like, you have to walk out? Come on, guys, I have to take a dump. Like, seriously,
yeah.
That's a serious consideration. Like, how the hell are you supposed to fight when you feel like you're about to shit yourself,
The way you set up that refueling process can probably help there for sure. So on the one side, we have the consideration of an athlete who is having certain gastrointestinal symptoms that makes them not want to really consume meals. And that can be a challenge to try and get them to refuel. So with that, that's where it's super valuable to have something like those liquid meals, where we can at least say, okay, even can you just start sipping on this over the course of the next hour, that we know we're getting some of this back into your system. But even at that, after a while, for anyone that's consumed carbohydrate powder, there's only so much carb drinks and carb gels that you can consume without feeling horrible. So then the challenge is, okay, what types of foods are going to be useful but are not so unappealing to the athlete that they're not going to want to do it? And so that would be, we might have them have, let's say, a high carb snack like rice cakes that feel kind of quite light. They're very easy to get down, and they can just consistently snack on them over a significant period of time. And things like that might be useful because doesn't feel too heavy. It's not going to impact digestion too much. So having some very easily digestible carbohydrate sources like that is useful. In terms of the stress causing symptoms like that can impact performance, that's certainly a consideration. And I think that's one of the benefits to having a pre-planned regular feeding schedule that the athlete does for each time they make weight and each time they compete, because they know how they respond to that food coming back in their system, right? And when they're typically going to go to the bathroom, or how they digest certain meals. And through those experiences, you can come up with a schedule of feeding for the athlete that is the least likely to cause any detriment as they're starting their warm-up, and especially hopefully as they're not about to enter the cage. So that's why we will do things like change that rehydration strategy I mentioned. We will stop that probably about 2 to 3 hours before they begin their warm-up, and then from that point, instead of having a set amount of fluid to consume, it's just sip on it whenever you want, whenever you feel that you need some. But there's no specific requirement, because by that stage they should be rehydrated, and also we don't want them just to continue to have to urinate as they're already nervous and already trying to warm up and already having a million other things to think about. So there are some considerations that I think are useful, and having a consistency in what you're doing might help mitigate some of that stuff.
Because I know just for myself, like even for something as non-significant compared to what these guys are going through, like having a hard leg workout, I prefer actually going into it fasted and just having a big dinner the day before, because I find that if I eat, then I'm also a bit anxious about the weights I have to hit. Like I just get bloated, and that's not really the thing to feel during a leg workout. So that's what I asked.
Absolutely. And just kind of tying into that body awareness, because I think you see this quite a bit in powerlifting, that there's this wide variation in how people like to feel going into certain sessions. You have this one group of people on one extreme who like the feeling of getting a bloat on specifically before they go and lift, and then other people, and I would put myself in that category as well, I can't imagine any worse feeling than trying to have to train when I'm feeling like horrifically over bloated from a massive meal. So, and then there's people obviously in between. So I think just having that awareness of what you feel best with, and that often trumps what would be ideal from whatever kind of theoretical nutrient perspective we can come up with.
If it was up to you, would you get rid of weight cutting completely, or would you change it? What kind of changes would you implement? You said you work with some fighters from 1FC. Obviously, they do things a bit differently there, from what I understand. Like they also test hydration status, so you're not allowed to step on scale dehydrated, as in something like a UFC would be able to do. Like, do you like that better, or do you find that less health, or do you think that has less health impact long term, or how would you change this whole process?
So from an absolute ideal perspective, and we're looking at fighter safety, then if you got rid of weight cutting completely, then it removes the problem. So that would be great. The problem is that isn't really practically feasible. Like, I just don't see a way that you can organize the sport to make that happen. One potential way that you almost eliminate the possibility of weight cutting is the closer you put that weigh in to immediately at the start of the fight. Now, again, this becomes logistically almost impossible to try and organize guys to weigh in just before they're about to get into the cage. And especially as you get to places that have sold tickets for people to come and see fighters, and already one of their biggest concerns is fighters pulling out on the week of fights or missing weight. Doing that on the way to the cage probably is never going to happen. So the question is, how do we try and make it unlikely that athletes are going to cut large amounts of weight? And I'm not sure I have a really good answer to this, because I think athletes are going to be drawn to doing it even if it doesn't serve their best interests, because they're just unaware of the downsides of it. So for example, you could say, well, if we had weigh-ins that are on, let's say, the morning of a fight, and they have less time to cut weight, surely they'd start cutting less weight. It's like, no, probably most athletes would try and cut just as much, but they just don't have time to rehydrate, which was kind of one of the reasons why the UFC have now do their weigh-ins on the, say, a Friday morning, as opposed to waiting until that afternoon, and then they end up doing a ceremonial weigh-in for TV, so to give athletes more time to rehydrate. Then you have the issue of, if you have so much time, as in we could have up to 36 hours sometimes, in that case there is a huge drive to cut a large amount of weight, because you have all this time to rehydrate and refuel. So how you go about getting rid of it, maybe the answer relies in some sort of hydration testing that has some of its issues as well. And it just is going to be hard to know at what point it becomes feasible to do. And the other big consideration with MMA specifically is that you have to get all these various different athletic commissions on board. So there's no kind of universal consensus that we could get to straight away. It would have to start with, say, California or Las Vegas, one of the commissions having a certain rules and standards that then get adopted by others, but it just becomes a bit more tricky to coordinate all in one go. So it's a tough one that I don't really have a good answer to as of yet, because I've thought about it quite a bit, and I would love to kind of present this mastermind answer to someone, but as of yet I haven't been able to come up with something that not only eradicates all the downsides of weight cutting, but also fits in with the interests of the organizers and fighters and so on.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Rogan, I think he said the same thing, that he would like to get rid of weight cutting, but fighters are, like you said, they would do it regardless, so they would just be exposed to a higher risk from, because that's why I know that, for example, jiu-jitsu has 2 hours weigh-ins or even mat side weigh-ins, but there you don't have strikes and you don't have to defend, someone trying to kick your head off.
So, I mean, like, you could go to a jiu-jitsu competition, and oftentimes, as I'm sure you've seen, you could have a situation, depending on how it's organized on the day, but you could weigh in and you could be on the mat like really soon after that, almost no time to do anything, like straight over and competing. And so that gets rid of a lot of the incentive to cut a large amount of weight. But you, of course, still have competitors that are cutting weight for a jiu-jitsu competition. So you could extrapolate that out and say, well, yeah, if we try and make it impossible for athletes, they're probably still going to do some sort of weight cut to try and get that 1% benefit, and they're just going to cause more harm. So it's a really tricky situation of how to enforce no weight cutting. Like saying that we're going to eliminate weight cutting is one thing, but how do you actually enforce that is another trickier issue.
It's a complicated issue, and we have already gone the pre-scheduled time. So thank you, Danny, again. This was a really awesome conversation. It was a pleasure to talk to you. MMA is something I am very much a big fan of, even just from a pure entertainment point of view. So it was very nice to also be educated on this side of the business. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on. I love talking about this stuff. So thanks for asking me.
All right, so that was episode 42 of the Muscle Engineer podcast with Danny Lennon. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you also find it valuable. Now, as usual, I will end the episode with some of my takeaways, which in this case won't be many, because as you can imagine, MMA and weight cutting, all that stuff is not really my expertise. So I don't really have a whole lot of personal insights to add into it, aside from what Danny already has covered. I will just finish with 2 notes. One, if you're interested in this, then you can either hire Danny or one of his colleagues to, do the work for you if you want to work with them as in an athlete-coach relationship, or if you're someone who would like to get educated on this so as to serve as a coach, or whatever the term is, nutritional counselor, professional weight maker. Regardless, hope Daniel doesn't mind me mentioning this. He said that he is actually working on a course that will take you step by step through the process and will teach you how to actually do the kind of stuff we mentioned here. Obviously, this will be a paid product, but still, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to learn from one of the best in the business when it comes to this. So I would keep an eye out for that in case you're interested. And the second takeaway, which is a more practical one, is once again to highlight the difference between peak weeks, water intake, and simply the goal of the whole process between MMA versus bodybuilding. Like, it seems to me it goes both ways. Like, MMA coaches, look at bodybuilding and they start potentially implementing some of the strategies they use, water loading and water cutting and stuff for bodybuilding, or at least it seems to me that some bodybuilding coaches have taken some of those practices and implemented them into bodybuilding, because other than that, I can't explain why people still stop their water intake, for example, between 24 to 36 hours before the actual contest. Like, it only gets them looking worse. I would hate for bodybuilding coaches to give advice to MMA athletes when it comes to weight cutting, because it's also not the same. So I would just say, stay in the lane and know your goals, know what you're trying to get out of this peak week, and act accordingly. That's all I had to say for this week. As always, If you enjoy these episodes, please leave a rating on iTunes, Apple Podcast, whatever it's called these days, Podbean, Stitcher, wherever you get these episodes from. Share it with a friend. Tag me on your Instagram. All that stuff is very, very, very much appreciated. Word of mouth is essentially how this podcast will grow. So thank you in advance if you do any of those things. If you're interested in coaching or you have any questions, just, hit me up on one of the social media accounts. I always have linked in the description of these episodes, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you, and until next week, may your gains be loyal.